Welcome to Nightmares Incorporated, where our goal is to make your sleep anything but restful. So sit back, relax, and enjoy tonight's tale, entitled The Hidden God. The first light of spring filtered through the tall windows of the Fulcrum History Museum, casting golden patterns on the marbled floors. Located in the heart of Trenton, Massachusetts, the museum stood as the glowing center of the town's rich historical tapestry, its stately neoclassical architecture blending seamlessly with the blossoming cherry trees lining the cobblestone pathways just outside. The scent of fresh blooms mingled with the faint aroma of polished wood, aged parchment, and protective lacquer used for the artifacts, creating an atmosphere steeped in both nature and history. Inside, the museum hummed with quiet excitement. Though the hour was still early, a handful of visitors had already begun exploring its grand halls, their footsteps echoing softly against the high ceilings. Among them, a family paused before a diorama depicting Trenton's 18th century founding, the children whispering questions to their parents about the settlers' lives, their eyes wide with curiosity. Nearby, a solitary student, armed with a notebook and a vintage film camera, studied an exhibit on indigenous craftsmanship, pausing now and then to scribble notes about the intricate beadwork or capture the delicate patterns engraved in ceremonial tools. The centerpiece of the museum's spring exhibition was Echoes of the Past, a collection of artifacts unearthed from various places around the world, the purpose being to showcase the ingenuity and artistic skill of ancient cultures. Display cases gleamed under the morning sunlight, showcasing items such as a set of finely crafted arrowheads, a collection of hand-woven baskets dyed with natural pigments, and an exquisitely restored 16th century European map, its edges frayed by time, yet its cartographic details astonishingly preserved. Each piece seemed to tell a mesmerizing story, disclosing secrets of lives lived long ago, and hinting at the greater heights humanity would one day reach. In the courtyard, the museum cafe was coming to life like a spring garden itself. Tables had been set under the shade of budding magnolia trees, their ivory petals forming a delicate carpet on the polished stone. The sound of a distant fountain mingled harmoniously with the chirping of sparrows and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, altogether creating a serene, almost meditative backdrop for those enjoying a leisurely coffee or tea. A young couple sat together, their laughter and animated conversation punctuating the calm as they shared a pastry. Nearby, an elderly gentleman, his tweed jacket matching the timeless mood, sketched the scene with graceful strokes of charcoal, capturing the fleeting beauty of nature and the timeless artistry of human connection. The museum's docents, dressed in smart navy blue uniforms with silver pins denoting their expertise, moved with purpose through the halls, eager to assist visitors or guide them to the day's special exhibits. Beyond the exhibits, the museum seemed to revel in the season itself. The gardens, meticulously maintained by a team of dedicated horticulturists, were a spectacle of color and fragrance. Tulips in fiery reds, yellows, and oranges danced in the gentle breeze, while clusters of lilacs and hyacinths provided bursts of purple and blue contrast. Benches scattered throughout the pathway invited visitors to sit, reflect, and soak in the beauty of a morning that seemed almost enchanted. By mid-morning, the museum's energy had grown livelier, with more visitors entering through its grand oak doors, their steps greeted by the soft strains of a mechanical harp playing in the foyer. Groups of school children, their excitement barely contained, followed their teachers in neat lines, their animated chatter a cheerful counterpoint to the otherwise tranquil space. A mother tried to keep pace with her inquisitive toddler, who was enthralled by a model steam engine in the industrial wing, his tiny fingers pressing buttons that lit up parts of the display. On this spring morning, beneath a sky so blue it seemed painted, the museum offered more than education. It offered a profound celebration of discovery, connection, and the stories that define humanity itself. Edward Blake arrived at the Fulcrum History Museum at 11:30 in the morning, his bespectacled eyes taking in the various scenes of activity around the building. It always made him feel slightly more at ease to see people enjoying history. Although he knew to many of them the displays were little more than curious baubles dug up from the past and put on display for them to gawk at. But for a few of them, hopefully the younger patrons, they might see the lessons that each piece contained. They might see that understanding of the past always assisted in understanding the present and demystifying the future. Patterns could be seen throughout history if one looked hard enough. Patterns that make the astute realize that everything that is happening, and ever will happen, has already happened before in some form. That regardless of humanity's current level of technology, and our own perceived civilized nature compared to our ancient ancestors, the human experience has actually changed very little. People still needed to eat, sleep, and shit. And as long as all three of those needs were satisfactorily met, civilization would continue to trundle along. It was when one of those three basic needs was threatened that revolution happened. And with revolution comes reform, and the misguided notion that we are now doing things better than they did before, when usually all we have done is devise new ways to eat, sleep, and shit. His fellow professors at Coleman University often chided Blake for his pessimistic nature regarding humanity, pointing out that human civilization has improved leaps and bounds beyond what our ancestors' lives were like. But Blake couldn't see it. Underneath the designer clothes, the name-brand shoes, smartwatches, cell phones, and the myriad of modern toys, he still only saw tribes. People ready to become a part of the collective hive mind known throughout history as the mob at the slightest provocation. Humanity wasn't much different than they were in the 1300s in Blake's opinion. They only smelled better. Blake knew that he was in the minority in this assessment, and was always perfectly willing to be proven wrong. However, the headlines in his morning papers, and the news that came through his nightly television, consistently reminded him that he was not. As Blake wandered through the museum's halls, making his way for the conservation area, his thoughts drifted inward, tracing the winding paths of his own personal history. He remembered his younger self, a spirited idealist with an insatiable curiosity for the past, eager to unearth humanity's triumphs and learn from its missteps. He had once believed that history was humanity's teacher, that its lessons could guide societies toward brighter futures. Back then, each historical account felt like a key to unlocking the mysteries of human progress, a roadmap to a better world. But over the years, his belief in progression, in some grand arc of improvement, had eroded like a stone under relentless waves, leaving only the raw sediment of skepticism behind. Blake could pinpoint moments, sharp as shards of glass, that had shaped his worldview. The first was his disillusionment during graduate school, when the idealized visions of history painted by textbooks were peeled back to reveal the darker, cyclical truths hidden beneath. Late nights spent poring over journals and primary sources revealed revolutions that promised equality but delivered new hierarchies, wars that claimed to secure peace but ignited fresh conflicts, and golden ages of prosperity built upon the backs of the downtrodden. Patterns emerged like constellations, beautiful in their symmetry, yet unflinchingly cold and unchanging. It became clear to him that history was not a series of ascending steps on a ladder, but rather a carousel spinning endlessly, with humanity as its passengers, each generation fooled into believing it was moving forward when the ride only circled back to where it began. The embrace of nihilism was not immediate, but gradual, like sediment accumulating in a riverbed. He recalled his early years of teaching, filled with enthusiasm and a genuine desire to inspire young minds. He had tried, with every ounce of passion he could muster, to regale his students with tales of valor, ingenuity, and resilience, hoping to ignite the same love for history he himself had once felt. But most of them were indifferent, mildly curious at best. Their minds were tethered to the fleeting dramas of their own lives, their attention divided by the constant buzz of smartphones and social media. Blake's optimism waned with each passing semester, replaced by the quiet certainty that the lessons of history, however profound, were often drowned out by the deafening noise of the present and the ephemeral distractions it offered. And yet this belief, this conviction that nothing ever truly changed, had made him an excellent historian and researcher. It freed him from the shackles of idealism and allowed him to examine the past with unflinching honesty. He could see the threads connecting the rise and fall of civilizations, the economic crises that ignited revolutions, the ideological shifts that reshaped societies, and the unchanging human nature that underpinned them all. His research was meticulous, his analysis was razor-sharp, because he was not distracted by hope or despair. He simply observed and recorded, documenting humanity's intricate dance around the same eternal truths with a precision born of dispassionate clarity. As a professor, Blake had become adept at challenging his students to think critically, even if his worldview wasn't theirs. He encouraged them to question the narratives of progress and dig deeper into the patterns beneath the surface of historical events. Some of his students left his classes frustrated, unsettled by his refusal to sugarcoat history's lessons or indulge in the comforting myths of human advancement. But others, like the solitary student he had noticed earlier with the vintage camera and notebook, seemed to thrive on the intellectual challenge. They saw the value in his approach, understanding that even if the carousel of history might never stop spinning, each generation could at least learn to ride with greater awareness, finding meaning in the act of observation itself. Blake's reflections were interrupted as he approached the museum's industrial wing, where a display of early 20th century machinery stood in polished splendor. He paused before a model steam engine, its gleaming brass and steel evoking an era when humanity believed it could conquer nature with unyielding innovation. A toddler pressed its buttons enthusiastically, lighting up parts of the display in a cascade of flickering lights and colorful dials, while the child's mother, juggling a stroller and a diaper bag, tried to keep pace with his boundless energy. Blake smiled faintly, acknowledging the timelessness of this small scene, yet feeling no cynicism towards it. Perhaps, he thought, there was merit in small joys, in finding meaning not in the grand arcs of history, but in fleeting moments where human connection and curiosity shone like beacons in the endless cycle. With a sigh, Blake moved on, passing through the industrial wing and into the spring exhibition, and from there to the conservation area contained beyond. After producing his credentials for the security guard standing outside, Blake was admitted to the secret heart of the museum, where the artifacts that were either collected by archaeologists or donated by the museum's patrons were studied, cleaned up, and painstakingly prepared for display to the curious masses. It was one of these pieces that Blake had been called in to advise upon, an artifact that had been fished up from Narragansett Bay on the north side of Rhode Island Sound. From what Blake had been told over the phone the prior evening, a man by the name of Philip Brentworst, from all accounts an eccentric billionaire who had more money than sense, had taken up diving in order to explore the bay that was off of his home state. Yet despite the foolhardy nature of amateur diving, Brentworst's expeditions had produced an artifact that could not be properly identified by the museum staff or the various researchers who were in normal association with them. Brentworst had donated this artifact, along with a couple of curiosities collected from the dozens of century-old shipwrecks from the surrounding waters, with the request that it be placed in a small exhibit titled Treasures of Narragansett. Blake had been called in, given his extensive years of travel and research, to see if he could assist in identifying the artifact that would be the centerpiece of this small display. Blake entered the conservation area and was approached by a smartly dressed man who looked like he was fresh out of college. "Professor Blake?" the young man inquired in a voice that Blake recognized from his phone call the previous evening. "Yes," he responded, sticking out his hand in greeting. "And you must be Lucas." "Good ear," the young man said as he shook Blake's hand. "That's me." So not a fresh-faced college student, but the curator of the Fulcrum Museum, having either received that position at an astonishingly young age, or having that special breed of genetics that kept him looking 27 until his late 50s. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Professor," Lucas went on. "I've been a fan of yours for some time. Your papers regarding the migration period in Europe were fascinating, and the research you've done on what you refer to as the missing final pharaoh of the Third Dynasty has been thought-provoking. It's actually that research that led me to call you. While we can't identify what we have, I do get an Egyptian feel from it. I might be wrong, and Narragansett would certainly be an odd place to find an artifact from ancient Egypt, but so many tombs were plundered during the early to mid-1800s, with not the best record-keeping, that it's not too far-fetched." "It certainly isn't," Blake agreed, knowing full well that archaeological research in those days was near indistinguishable from grave robbing in certain circles. Many ancient treasures were destroyed, stolen, or reburied out of fear that they conflicted with the personal, religious, or political beliefs of the archaeologist who found them. Fortunately, things have improved in that area over the years. "May I see it?" Blake requested after a pause. "Of course," Lucas said with a slightly comical palm to his own forehead. "Sorry, Professor Blake, just a bit starstruck here. Let me show you what you came to see." "Thank you," Blake responded, following the young man when he turned and headed deeper into the conservation area. Lucas led Blake through the dimly lit heart of the museum, where shadows stretched long and the faint hum of dehumidifiers seemed unnaturally loud in the otherwise relative silence. The air almost seemed to carry an electrical charge that made Blake's skin prickle. Some of the artifacts lining the walls seemed to watch their every step, their labels faded and some barely legible, as though time itself conspired to erase their histories. The further they walked, the more Blake became aware of an eerie stillness, broken only by their footsteps echoing on the cold tile floor. Finally, Lucas gestured towards a solitary table illuminated by an oddly harsh, sterile light that felt out of place, as though it didn't belong here. "You'll understand why this has baffled us so far," Lucas said, his voice low and almost hesitant, as if the object before them demanded quiet reverence or fear. On the table sat a stone of indeterminate color, encased in an intricate gold lining that gleamed faintly, though the source of the light seemed wrong. The closer Blake's gaze moved to the stone, the more the light seemed to dim, as if it were being absorbed by the artifact itself. Its surface shimmered with a strange spectral quality, and its shape was disconcerting. Almost a trapezohedron, but twisted, warped, and wrong. The angles were sharp, yet disjointed, defying logic and symmetry, and the very sight of it made Blake's stomach churn with unease. The colors were off as well. Blake could not tell what type of stone it was. From one angle, the color appeared to be amethyst, from another, ruby, and yet with only a slight shift in perspective, it was now emerald. Blake leaned closer, his breath catching as he examined the object. The surface was unnaturally smooth, seemingly untouched by tools or human hands, yet it radiated an unsettling energy, as though it resented being gazed upon. The golden casement that surrounded it seemed fragile, almost desperate to contain whatever lay within. But the artifact's presence felt overpowering, unconstrained by its gilded confines. "This is extraordinary," Blake murmured, though his words felt hollow, as if spoken from a distant place. "The geometry, it's not right. It's almost a trapezohedron, but the sides, they're distorted, impossibly. Its design doesn't make sense. I see why you believe it to be Egyptian, given their intricate work and love of all things gold, but this does not appear to be of their design. And if it is, it's from a period that is lost to history. To be honest, I'm at a loss as to how this could even exist." "That is what's been puzzling us as well," Lucas admitted, his voice tight, his hands gripping the edges of the table like he needed to anchor himself. "It feels wrong, doesn't it? Almost like it was meant to be buried, hidden. But here it is, staring back at us. I've spent countless hours studying it, but the more I try to understand it, the less sense it makes. That's why I was hoping that you could help us shed some light on it." Blake straightened, though the motion felt forced, his body reluctant to turn away from the stone. The air around it seemed charged, each breath he took heavier than the last. His mind wrestled with the implications, not just of its existence, but of its presence here, so far from anything familiar. The artifact seemed to hum faintly, just beyond perception, as though trying to disclose secrets too ancient and terrible to comprehend. "Initially, I'm hard-pressed to understand how anyone could have carved this, but it's obviously not natural," Blake said, his voice now hushed, almost reverent. "And if made by human hands, then for what purpose?" Lucas shook his head, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, Blake noticed. "So far, it's being considered as an artifact of unknown origin, but every attempt to analyze it has been met with failure. The gold surrounding it suggests it was revered, or feared, but the stone itself..." He hesitated, his voice dropping further. "It's unlike anything we've ever seen. The more time I spend with it, the more it feels like it doesn't want to be understood, as though it's rejecting us." This assertion did not bother Blake, or even make him glance at Lucas oddly. It was normal for people to anthropomorphize inanimate objects, to prescribe emotion or intent to things that cannot possibly possess either. Blake had to admit that he was feeling some of the unease that he sensed from the other man. He felt his pulse quicken, his gaze unable to move from the artifact. The air seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the room pressing closer. "Was there anything else that Brentworst found along with this?" he asked. "Only the box it was contained in, which brings its own mysteries to the table," Lucas replied, gesturing towards a rectangular wooden box measuring 1 foot by 2 feet, and appeared to be made from a polished wood that was so dark it was almost black. Blake's fingers twitched at his side as he stared down at the artifact, and the box that had contained it seemed to mock him with their very existence. "Did your staff already clean and polish the box?" Blake asked, certain that the answer would be yes. If this wood had been underwater for any length of time, it should be bloated, warped. Yet the box was in what could only be described as perfect condition. "We barely touched it," Lucas replied. "We questioned Brentworst when he donated it, given its condition, but he claimed that all he did was dry it off after he fished it out of the bay." Lucas forced a hollow smile, a shadow of excitement flickering behind his unease. "This could easily be the archaeological find of the century, Professor Blake, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't creep me out a little. Maybe once we figure out who made it, and maybe get an idea of when it was made, that feeling will dissipate." As they stood in a momentary silence, the artifact seemed to pulse faintly, its unnatural geometry defying reason, almost giving off a silent threat that not all mysteries are meant to be solved. "I'll have access to it after hours, I assume?" Blake finally spoke. "I do my best work on my own, and unfortunately I only have a limited time here before I am to begin a speaking tour on the end of the Third Dynasty." "Of course," Lucas answered quickly. "I'll give you the combination to the keypad out front, and all you'll need to do is check in with security if you happen to need to leave and return. Other than that, Professor, it's all yours. You will have unlimited access." "Thank you," Blake replied. Apologizing that he needed to assist a couple of the other researchers, Lucas departed, leaving Blake alone with the artifact, which did not bother the older man in the slightest, as he had always done his best work when left alone with his thoughts. The trapezohedron loomed larger than it had at first glance, its jagged facets gleaming under the harsh overhead lights with an eerie brilliance. Measuring a foot across at its widest point, and standing 1.5 feet tall, the gemstone seemed wholly uncanny, its angular symmetry defying the natural order. As Blake leaned closer, his breath shallow, the light refracted through the gem's crystalline depths in ways that made his eyes ache, bending and twisting as though it were playing with him. With deliberate care, Blake began his observations, his hands steady despite the growing prickle of unease crawling along his spine. He tilted the artifact, letting the light catch its surface, and then froze. Faint etchings marred the gem's otherwise pristine exterior, markings so fine they could easily have been dismissed as scratches. But these were no random abrasions. They were symbols, unfamiliar and ancient, and as Blake studied them, he could have sworn they shifted under his gaze, their shapes warping in defiance of his perception. The etchings twisted and danced, seemed to grow, and then they were gone. Blake rubbed his eyes and looked again. They were still gone, as if they had never been there. "Of course they weren't," Blake said quietly to himself. "You're just seeing things. Eyes must be tired from the drive." Blake rubbed his eyes again, adjusted his glasses, and returned to his work. Hours crawled by, marked only by the growing sensation that Blake was being watched. The feeling crept over him like a shadow with a will of its own, cold and suffocating. He glanced up abruptly, his senses on edge, scanning the room for the source of his unease. Lucas was across the conservation area, engrossed in conversation with another researcher, and no one else was within sight. Yet the sensation of being watched refused to abate, as if unseen eyes bore into him from some hidden corner. Blake shook his head, his rational mind struggling to quell the unease, but the creeping dread lingered. He turned his focus back to the artifact, determined to press forward despite the tricks that his mind was obviously playing on him. Setting up a microscope, he adjusted the focus and peered into the gem's depths, to try and gain a better understanding of the large stone's internal structures. He saw a shadow, quick and furtive, as it darted through the crystalline lattice, vanishing before he could discern its form. His breath caught, and he pulled back, his heart pounding. Was this another illusion? A trick of the light? What the fuck is wrong with me? Blake thought, feeling the beginnings of a panic attack form within the back of his mind, his heart refusing to slow down. His hands began to tremble slightly as he moved to measure the gemstone's density with a hydrostatic scale. The results were impossible. The trapezohedron was denser than diamond, which couldn't be right. Blake's thoughts spiraled, questions colliding in his mind. What kind of force could create such a material? And far more perplexing than that, what sort of ancient tool could have carved a gemstone this dense? Considering the odd yet precise angles, what modern tool could have carved it so seamlessly without cracking the stone? The artifact seemed to laugh at him with its defiance of the natural world. Finally, he reached for a refractometer, desperate for any sensible answers. As he activated the device, the room was consumed by an explosion of blinding white light. It struck him like a physical blow, searing into his eyes and sending a lance of pain through his skull. He cried out, staggering up and backwards from the stool he had been sitting on, the air thick with an unearthly silence that seemed to swallow his voice. The pain bloomed into a migraine so intense it felt as though the light itself had embedded into his very mind, carving its presence into his thoughts. Lucas was at his side in an instant, his movements hurried but cautious, as though he too felt the oppressive energy radiating from the artifact. "Blake, what happened? Are you all right?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. The light," Blake whispered hoarsely, his eyes squeezed shut against the lingering pain. "It's like it burned into me. I've never seen anything like it." Lucas frowned, his unease visible despite his attempt at composure. "What light, Professor Blake?" he said. "I didn't see anything." Blake wanted to ask the man how he had not seen the explosion of light that had lit the room like a solar flare, but his head was pounding too hard to protest. "You've been at this for hours, Professor," Lucas continued. "The journey up from Virginia must have worn you down. Please, go back to your hotel and rest. Whatever this thing is, it'll still be here tomorrow." Blake hesitated, his curiosity battling against the throbbing pain in his skull, but the weight of his exhaustion and the oppressive atmosphere pushed him to relent. He nodded weakly. You're right. I'll come back tomorrow." As he gathered his things, he cast one last glance at the trapezohedron. Its faceted surface gleamed mockingly, as though it knew it had defeated him for the night. And yet, beneath the ominous shimmer, Blake felt its silent call, a call that promised answers if he was willing to persist. After departing the Uber car that Lucas had called for him, Blake trudged back up to his hotel room, each step heavier than the last, as if unseen hands were dragging him down. His mind reeled with the echo of the light, searing, unnatural, more alive than anything he could comprehend. When he reached his room, he locked the door with trembling hands, instinctively double-checking it, though he could not say why. The room offered no solace. The shadows seemed thicker than usual, curling into corners, pooling under the furniture like they had been waiting for him. He drew the curtains tightly shut, the metallic scrape of the rings on the rod unnervingly loud in the silence. Darkness enveloped him, oppressive and suffocating, but it was the only thing he craved. He switched off the final lamp, plunging the room into an inky void that felt alive and comforting. He collapsed onto the bed, his body sinking into the mattress, but rest did not come right away. His head pounded as if his mind were on fire. His limbs twitched as if low voltages of electricity were coursing through him. When sleep finally claimed him, it was restless and broken, an uneasy truce with his overtaxed mind. In his dreams, he found that he was running, no, fleeing, through a cavernous maze, its walls slick with a foul, glistening damp. The air was heavy and fetid, clinging to him like decay. His footsteps echoed unnervingly loud, yet they were not the only sounds within the maze. There was something else behind him, near silent, but ever present, closing the distance with each passing second. The thing in the shadows was not something he saw, but something he felt. It was a weight, an inevitability, a crushing certainty that it would catch him. Each turn in the labyrinth led to more darkness, more walls, more dead ends. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but fear drove him forward. A single inexplicable thought surfaced in his mind, unbidden and alien. "It is the father of all bats." The words chilled him, though he had no idea what they meant. The presence grew nearer, its intangible weight pressing against him. He could feel its hunger, its malice, and something far worse, its familiarity. It knew him. It had always known him. Blake stumbled, his breath hitching, and as the darkness closed in, he screamed. But the scream did not end. It followed him, dragged him from the dream and into waking. He jolted back to the conscious world, his breath ragged and shallow, his heart pounding so violently he thought it might tear free from his chest. Cold sweat clung to his skin, and for a moment he thought he was still trapped within the nightmare. But the nightmare was nothing compared to reality. He found that he was not in the sanctuary of his hotel room. Instead, he sat on the familiar worn stool in the museum, the darkness around him thick and almost tactile. The trapezohedron loomed before him on the table, its faceted surface catching the faint ambient glow and reflecting it in unsettling fractured patterns. It pulsed faintly, as though alive, and for a moment Blake thought he saw shapes within its depths, shapes that writhed in impossible, unnatural ways. He recoiled, but could not look away at once. His watch read 1:30 a.m., but the time meant nothing. He had no memory of returning to the museum, no recollection of passing through the locked doors or giving his credentials to security. The absence of memory chilled him far more than the nightmare had. How long had he been here? What had brought him back? What had he been doing? The artifact seemed to gaze at him, its gleam a cruel invitation. He reached out instinctively, his hand trembling as it hovered just above its surface. His breath hitched. The room seemed to hum, a low vibration that resonated in his chest, growing louder the closer his hand came. His fingers curled back, retreating, but the pull of the trapezohedron was undeniable. It called to him, whispering promises he could not understand, and threats he dared not face. "What is happening to me?" he whispered, his voice little more than a croak lost in the oppressive silence. The shadows did not answer. The trapezohedron did not relent. Instead, it gleamed brighter, as though it had been waiting, biding its time, and deep within, something stirred. A pale blue light began to emanate from the artifact, banishing the darkness of the room with its own illumination. Blake leaned closer to the artifact and peered into its glowing depths. He saw a fog within, looking almost like a part of the sky was contained within the trapezohedron. The fog began to part, and within its depths and within his mind, a vision began to form. The vision gripped Blake with a force that made him feel like a mere spectator to his own mind. The museum around him seemed to fade, first growing translucent, then insubstantial. He suddenly saw the Egyptian desert stretching endlessly out before him, golden dunes shimmering under an unforgiving sun. The pyramids rose in the distance, monolithic and eternal, their majestic silhouettes framed by the fiery horizon. Yet it was not their grandeur that held his gaze. It was the shadow moving through the desert, a figure cloaked in black, its robe seemingly woven from the void itself. As the figure drew closer, Blake's breath caught. The robe hung shapelessly, absorbing the light without reflection, while the face, bland and featureless, seemed carved from solid darkness. Its skin had the texture of charcoal, rough but impenetrable, unyielding to the world around it. The sight of this being sent shivers racing down Blake's spine, yet he could not turn away. This figure was not a man. It was a shadow that pretended to be one. The figure carried a box, plain and unremarkable, yet brimming with significance. Blake's pulse quickened with excitement as a realization struck him. The trapezohedron was inside that box. He knew it instinctively, as though the knowledge had been burned into his consciousness by the artifact itself. He watched in fascination as the dark figure stepped into the throne room of a grand pharaoh. He watched as this figure influenced the priests of Egypt, soon forming a cult that overthrew the standing pharaoh and crowning one of their own. Nephren-Ka, Blake thought, the final pharaoh of the Third Dynasty, the Forgotten King. Blake's vision followed these ancient scenes as though guided by invisible hands. The shadow presented the box to the new pharaoh, and as Nephren-Ka lifted its lid, the trapezohedron's light spilled forth, casting a pale glow across the chamber. The artifact's power overwhelmed the room, and Blake felt its oppressive weight as surely as those gathered a millennia ago did. Blake saw Egypt transformed under Nephren-Ka's rule, its once thriving lands twisted into an empire of blood and terror. The visions granted by the artifact became the foundation of his tyrannical reign, a source of influence so absolute that nothing could challenge his grip. Nephrin Ka sacrificed everything to the deity of the artifact: people, crops, animals, feeding its insidious hunger in exchange for visions that ensured his dominion remained unbroken. The pharaoh's kingdom descended into chaos, its sands soaked with the blood of countless victims. The pyramids, once monuments to eternity, seemed to cast shadows longer and darker than ever before, as though bearing witness to the horrors unfolding beneath them. Blake felt every sacrifice, every scream, every despairing cry, and yet his gaze remained fixed on Nephrin Ka, who stood impervious to it all, a vessel for the artifact's insidious will. The vision shifted, showing that after decades of the cursed pharaoh's rule, the people of Egypt finally rose up to rebel against their tyrant. In a normal course of events, the rebellion would have been crushed, for the visions from the trapezohedron had allowed Nephrin Ka to consistently stay ahead of his enemies, both foreign and domestic. But it seemed that the god of the artifact had grown bored with the pharaoh's rule, and it abandoned him. Blake saw as the pharaoh was overthrown, executed, and resigned to a hidden tomb, buried by the sands, his name forgotten to history. The vision began to collapse in on itself, the desert swirling into a vortex of light and darkness. Blake gasped, feeling the pull of the trapezohedron dragging him back. The museum's walls reappeared around him, dim and oppressive. His heart pounded furiously, and his mind buzzed with fragments of what he had seen. "No!" he croaked, his voice strained with desperate longing. "No! Show me more! Please!" he begged, running his hands over the smooth surface of the artifact. "Where did you come from? Who made you? Please, show me more!" Blake remained in the museum through the long hours of the night, bent over the artifact on the table, begging for the visions to return. His pleas to the artifact growing ever more fervent, but unanswered. The visions he had witnessed seemed to haunt him, lingering just out of reach, their tantalizing fragments buzzing against the edges of his weary mind. His voice, hoarse from hours of imploring, eventually faded into a desperate silence. The room felt heavy with an intangible presence, but no matter how earnestly he begged, the trapezohedron remained inert, its pale glow dimmed. As dawn broke and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the museum's high windows, the shadows receded reluctantly, as though loath to relinquish their grasp. Blake slumped down on his stool, utterly exhausted, his fingers still brushing the artifact's smooth, cool surface. The faint hum he thought he had felt earlier was now absent, leaving the air unnervingly still. The sound of approaching footsteps startled him from his daze, and moments later the door to the conservation area creaked open, letting in the sounds of morning activity in from beyond. Lucas strode in, his sharp gaze quickly sweeping over the room until it landed on Blake. His expression shifted from confusion to concern as he approached, taking in the disheveled state of the professor, whose unkempt hair, darkened eyes, and rumpled clothing bore the undeniable marks of a sleepless night. He stopped short, arms crossed, his tone firm but tinged with worry. "Blake," he said flatly, "have you been here all night?" Blake nodded slowly, his movements lethargic, as though he was dragging himself out of another world. His eyes, though shadowed by exhaustion, gleamed with an obsessive intensity. "I couldn't sleep," he muttered lamely. "I felt I should make up for having to leave early yesterday. And to be honest, I couldn't stop thinking about this thing. There's something about this artifact. It's unlike anything I've ever encountered. It's extraordinary." Lucas frowned, his gaze flickering to the trapezohedron as Blake spoke. "What are you talking about? Did you discover anything about it?" Blake straightened slightly, as though energized by the opportunity to explain. He gestured towards the artifact with an almost reverent air, his hands trembling ever so slightly. "First of all, it's denser than diamond. Far denser. To be honest, I'm not even sure how its shape was carved in the first place. And its light refraction." Blake's voice became hushed, almost awestruck. "The way it bends and amplifies light. It doesn't just scatter it. It's otherworldly, as though it defies the natural laws of physics themselves." He leaned closer to the trapezohedron, pointing to its edges. "But the gold lining," he continued, his voice now tinged with intrigue, "that's not part of its original design. I'm sure of it. It's too distinct. It bears all the hallmarks of Egyptian artistry, the intricate patterns, the techniques used to work it. I think it was added later, perhaps to give it a ceremonial or divine significance." Lucas raised an eyebrow, skepticism mingling with growing curiosity. "So you're saying the artifact predates the gold? How old do you think it is?" Blake hesitated, his gaze fixed on the trapezohedron as though searching its depths for answers. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "I don't know, but it's ancient. Maybe it was gifted to the Egyptians." Blake did not elaborate further, as he did not want to speak of the visions he had seen, not wanting the younger man to think he had gone mad. Lucas studied Blake for a long moment, his expression a mixture of interest and concern. Finally he sighed, his professional demeanor reasserting itself. "Blake, you should get some rest. You've already given us something on it. You were definitely the right person to call in for this particular artifact. I don't want you to burn yourself out." "Yes, you're right," Blake agreed, his mind finally becoming his own again, the exhaustion he felt pressing down upon him like a physical weight. Blake rose from his stool, gathered his overcoat, and headed out of the conservation area. He felt a pang when he reached the door, looking back at the artifact mournfully. He didn't want to leave it. It had spoken to him. He felt it was his, that it was meant for him. Blake shook his head and reasserted control over his own mind. "The hell is wrong with you?" he thought. "It's not yours, and you had a hallucination due to lack of sleep. It's not going anywhere. Now get a hold of yourself and get some rest." Yet even with this self-critique, Blake felt a deep regret as he exited the museum. Blake arrived back at his hotel room, but the artifact haunted him even there. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, he felt its presence like a shadow lingering at the edges of his mind. Rest was impossible. The artifact called to him, and every moment away from it felt like a mistake. He paced the length of the room with growing desperation, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. The vision he had seen was not fading. It loomed over him, vivid and unrelenting, like a ghost refusing to leave. Blake yanked open his satchel, spilling its contents onto the desk with frantic urgency. The books he carried seemed heavier now, their aged pages hiding secrets he was desperate to uncover. He tore through them, flipping past faded symbols and cryptic passages, his eyes dotting with feverish intensity. Time slipped away unnoticed, the sunlight outside disappearing into a murky twilight. By nightfall, the room had become a chaotic ruin of papers and books, their contents scattered like fragments of his unraveling mind. Blake stood by the window, staring out at the city swallowed by darkness. The museum loomed in his imagination, its halls quiet, the artifact waiting in ominous stillness. But he knew, he felt it deep in his bones, that it wasn't truly silent. It had spoken to him before, and it would again. He was certain of it. His pulse quickened as the night deepened. The all-consuming quiet of the hotel room pushed him to the brink. He grabbed his coat and notebook, his hands trembling as he stuffed his belongings into his bag. He couldn't ignore the pull any longer. The artifact wasn't done with him, and neither was he done with it. Sleep wasn't just unnecessary, it was unthinkable. Only the artifact could give him answers, and Blake felt dread and excitement intertwine as he opened the door to face the night, its darkness feeling ever so much closer. Blake entered the museum with the determination of a man on the verge of discovery, or madness. The security guard barely glanced up as he passed, his presence cloaked in the quiet resolve of desperation. His footsteps echoed softly through the empty halls, each one bringing him closer to the artifact that had rooted itself deep within his consciousness. When he reached it, the table seemed to shimmer under the pale light, the air thick with expectation. Blake extended a trembling hand, brushing against the smooth, cold surface of the artifact. He held his breath, waiting for the rush, the heat, the vision, the voice. He waited for the artifact to claim him once more, to reaffirm its connection, to prove he hadn't imagined it all. But there was nothing. Blake exhaled slowly, his confidence faltering but not broken. It would take time, he reasoned. Perhaps he needed to attune himself, to reach out rather than simply wait. He placed both hands on the artifact now, his palms flat against its surface, his eyes closed as he murmured, "Speak to me. I'm here. Tell me what you are." Silence was his only answer. Hours slipped by unnoticed as Blake tried everything. He whispered to it, coaxed it, begged it. When those words failed, he resorted to pleading, his voice cracking as he implored the artifact to respond. At moments he fell to his knees, his forehead resting against the table as he surrendered to despair. Yet amidst the darkness of the museum and the fervor of his attempts, doubt began to creep in. Blake vacillated between certainty and disbelief, his mind a battleground of conflicting truths. One moment he knew, with the clarity of the vision in his mind, that it had been real, that he had felt the heat of the Egyptian sun, the grit of sand between his fingers, and the feel of it beneath his feet. And in the next, he was consumed with the thought that he had been undone by exhaustion, his senses betraying him in a cruel mirage of delusion. "Was it all a lie?" he muttered, his voice hoarse and ragged. He stared at the artifact, his vision blurring with tears he refused to shed. "No, it was real. It had to be real." The night stretched endlessly, the museum growing colder and quieter with each passing hour. Blake's determination gave way to frustration, frustration to exhaustion, and exhaustion to defeat. He leaned heavily against the table, his head bowed, his body drained of the manic energy that had propelled him here. The artifact remained silent, its surface unyielding, offering no answers, no visions, and no truths. Blake sat on the floor, his back against the wall, staring out at the first pale glimmers of dawn creeping through the museum windows. The artifact had not awakened, and Blake felt the crushing weight of reality pressing down upon him. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps he had imagined it all. Or perhaps it had spoken to him once, and once was all it ever intended to do. The light of day cast long shadows across the museum floor, and Blake rose slowly, his movements heavy with defeat. He walked away from the artifact without looking back. Blake left the museum before any of the staff arrived. Lucas would see his name on the sign-in sheet and know that he had again been there all night, but that was fine. He had told him that he worked better alone, and Lucas seemed like a good man. Blake was sure that he would give him his time to work his own method. The days blurred together as Blake spiraled deeper into his obsession. Sleep eluded him entirely, replaced by relentless pondering, studying, and memories of the artifact's vision. Food became little more than a passing thought, a requirement ignored in favor of his nightly pilgrimage to the museum. Each visit was driven by a faint hope, a desperate yearning that the artifact might awaken and reveal its secrets. By the third evening, Blake barely recognized the gaunt figure staring back at him in the mirror. His once sharp posture was slumped, his skin pale and ashen, and his hollow eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. The vibrant man who had once captivated audiences with his speaking tours was gone, replaced by a shadow of himself. He wondered with a creeping dread if this was the precipice of a nervous breakdown, a slow unraveling of his mind tethered to the artifact's unyielding silence. The speaking tour, once the highlight of his career, was postponed indefinitely. He could not leave the artifact. Not yet. Not while the possibility of answers still lingered in the air, tantalizing him with their elusive promise. Lucas, the museum's diligent and observant curator, had noticed Blake's growing deterioration. Though Blake appreciated the man's tact, Lucas's concern was evident in every interaction. One night, while Blake was signing out of the museum, Lucas approached him cautiously, yet firmly. "Professor," Lucas began, his voice steady but warm, "are you sure you're feeling okay? You've been here every night, working really hard, but you don't have to do everything alone. You know that, right?" Blake froze mid-signature. The genuine concern in Lucas' voice struck him unexpectedly, breaking through the fog of his exhaustion. He forced a smile, though it felt brittle and unnatural. "I appreciate your concern, Lucas, really. But this is something I need to figure out myself. It's not something anyone can help me with." Lucas nodded, but did not let the conversation end there. "Just remember," he added gently, "even the best minds need support sometimes. If you need to talk, I'm here. No one can take on the weight of the world alone." The words lingered in Blake's mind, reverberating with an uncomfortable resonance as he stood before the artifact later that night. His brow furrowed, his tired gaze locked on its inert surface. No one can do everything alone. The idea gnawed at him, refusing to be dismissed. Perhaps Lucas was right. Blake had approached the artifact stubbornly, as a solitary entity, a lone man seeking to unlock its mysteries. But what if the artifact required more? What if it demanded not the singular focus of one individual, but the collective energy, presence, and voices of others? What if it needed to resonate with a group? The thought flickered unsteadily at first, hesitant and fragile, but it grew with each passing moment. Blake placed both hands upon the trapezohedron, closed his eyes, and spoke to it. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice low, tired. "Do you want a congregation? Do you want more voices speaking to you?" After a moment long enough for Blake to believe that he had truly lost his mind, a response came, but not in words. It came in a fully formed thought, as if planted within his mind by unseen fingers. "Of course," Blake muttered. "Of course, I see. Yes, I see." He needed help. Another witness. And Blake knew who to call. Since Lucas had initially given him the idea that he needn't do everything alone, it was only fitting that he should ask him to assist with waking the artifact. Professor Blake pulled out his cell phone, and with fingers that mildly trembled with an excitement that bordered on zeal, he dialed Lucas' number. The museum's curator answered on the 7th ring. "Hello?" came his voice, sounding puffy from sleep. "Lucas, it's Edward. I need your help down at the museum." "Professor Blake?" Lucas asked rhetorically, the sleep dispelling from his voice. "Are you all right? What's going on?" "It's the artifact," Blake said, not hiding the excitement in his voice. "I need your help with the artifact. There's an experiment I'd like to try, but I can't do it alone." "What time is it, Professor?" Lucas asked, and Blake could almost see the younger man brushing the cobwebs from his mind. "It's 12:30 a.m., Blake answered. "I'm sorry for calling so late, but this couldn't wait until morning. You were right about this artifact, but also wrong," Blake continued. "It's not just the archaeological find of the century, but of all time. I think I know what it is, but I need your help to prove it." Lucas was quiet for a moment, and Blake held his breath. "I trust I'll receive a co-writing credit on whatever discoveries you publish?" Lucas said in a half-joking voice. "Lucas, if I'm right, you can receive all the credit for all I care. You can write the research paper on it with all of our findings, and I'll happily take the role of co-writer." "Well, I don't think that will be necessary," the younger man replied through the phone, but he did sound intrigued. After another momentary pause, Lucas made up his mind. "Okay, Professor. Give me half an hour and I'll be there." "Thank you, Lucas," Blake said, feeling a great weight roll off of his shoulders. He hung up the phone, feeling elated, knowing that this would work. Blake spent a couple of minutes gathering what he believed they would need, and then waited for Lucas to arrive, unable to stop pacing as the minutes ticked by. When Lucas arrived, Blake greeted him excitedly, slightly putting the other man off with his manic behavior. "When's the last time you slept, Professor?" Lucas asked. "I'll sleep once we're done here," Blake replied. "Thank you for coming, Lucas. This discovery is going to rewrite the history books. I promise you that." Looking intrigued more than cautious, Lucas followed Blake when the old professor turned and began moving towards the artifact on the table. "Okay, what do we do now?" Lucas asked once they stood in front of the trapezohedron. "I need you to look into it," Blake answered, his voice tinged with a barely contained excitement. Lucas looked at him curiously. "That's it?" he asked. "That's the start," Blake answered. "You need to look in there, so you'll have a better idea of what we need to do." "That doesn't," Lucas began, but Blake cut him off. "It'll make sense once you look in there, Lucas. Trust me." After one more skeptical look, Lucas did as he was asked and looked into the artifact. After a moment of peering into its depths, The younger man drew his breath in sharply. "It looks like there's a fog in there, Blake," Lucas said in disbelief. "And a light. It looks blue, or maybe green. Do you think there's an internal light source? And how is there fog in there? Do you have any—" His words were abruptly cut off as Blake brought the claw hammer he had been concealing down upon the back of the curator's head. There was a dull thunk sound and a quieter crack. Lucas cried out in surprise and pain and fell to the ground in a sprawl, his hands instinctively clutching at the wound in the back of his head. Blake was on him in an instant, rolling the other man onto his back. Wrapping his left hand around Lucas' throat, Blake brought the hammer down again and again, breaking the younger man's orbital bone, his cheekbone, the hammer smashing the bone and tearing through flesh. By the time he was finished, Blake's shoulder hurt, and there was little left of his victim's face, only a mess of flesh and shards of bone. Once the body quit twitching, Blake rose to his feet, blood dripping from the end of the hammer, and he was astonished that security had not responded to the struggle. Not sparing that too much thought, Blake approached the artifact again. This time he reached out with his bloodied hand and rubbed the blood of his sacrifice across the smooth surface of the trapezohedron. At once, the blood seemed to soak into the stone, like rain into dry soil, and a deep crimson light formed in the center of the artifact, and then bloomed out, filling the room with a blood-red glow. Feeling that he was no longer alone in the room, Blake looked up and saw the visage that looked carved from darkness looking at him from above the shining trapezohedron. Blake knew that he should fear this being, but as he looked into its unexpressive face, he knew that he needn't. He had called out to it, and it had answered. The shadowed monk, the god of the artifact, the crawling chaos. The dark figure pointed down at the trapezohedron, silently commanding Blake to look, to see the knowledge that he had earned. Blake did as he was instructed, and gazed into the depths of the artifact, watching mesmerized as the fog parted and the visions came forth. At first there was nothing but a swirling mist, but then the fog cleared, revealing an alien landscape bathed in eternal twilight. The ground was barren and cracked, its surface resembling a shattered mirror reflecting the pale light of a dying sun. Towering hive-like structures pierced the horizon, their forms pulsating faintly as if alive, their surfaces textured with intricate patterns. Within these monumental hives, Blake saw creatures, beings of a fungus, insect-like form, their chitinous shells gleaming faintly under the dim sunlight. Their bodies were segmented, adorned with translucent wings that shimmered like spun glass. They moved with precision, every motion purposeful, as they manipulated tools and devices that glowed faintly with an otherworldly energy. Machines hovered weightlessly, emitting soft hums that resonated through the air, their designs intricate beyond human comprehension. These machines appeared to operate not with levers or gears, but through some symbiosis of thought and form, a seamless fusion of biology and technology. Then the vision shifted. Blake saw these winged, human-sized, crab-like beings gathered in solemn reverence around the trapezohedron. It was smaller then, its angular surface embedded into what appeared to be an altar of living stone, veins coursing with a faintly luminescent liquid. A shadow descended upon them, a shadow that had no form, no shape, yet exuded a presence so overwhelming that even through the vision Blake felt its weight upon his very soul. The beings bowed deeply, their antennae trembling in what could only be interpreted as reverence or fear. They offered the trapezohedron to the living shadow. The shadow pulsed, a ripple of dark energy that seemed to permeate the air, acknowledging their devotion. The scene dissolved, only to be replaced by another. The artifact was now in the hands of ancient humans, a people who lived on a continent Blake did not recognize, their cities shimmering with grandeur. The civilization stretched across vast lands, its architecture breathtakingly detailed, with spires that cast surreal shadows under the magnificence of the sun. The people adorned themselves in ceremonial robes woven with metallic threads, their culture spiritual and technological, their dominion over the earth an absolute. Yet there was an undercurrent of unease. Blake watched as the rulers of this civilization held the trapezohedron aloft during ceremonies, their eyes reflecting its terrible glow. They grew enthralled, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though they were marionettes controlled by unseen strings. The faceless God within the artifact had claimed them, turning once proud leaders into hollow puppets, their voices drowned by whispers from the abyss. And as the vision continued, Blake bore witness to the inevitable fall of that society. The grand structures that once reached for the heavens crumbled, being buried beneath the relentless march of time. The people scattered, their cries muffled by the inexorable silence of ruin. The land itself seemed to wither, its lifeblood drained by the cursed artifact. Yet the trapezohedron remained, untouched and unyielding, a beacon of malevolence waiting for its next custodians. The cycle repeated as though it were a curse etched into the stone itself. Blake saw echoes of other great civilizations, ones hinted at in myths and legends, each rising to glory, only to fall in ruin, consumed by the unrelenting influence of the shining trapezohedron. Blake's heart pounded as the visions faded, leaving him trembling before the artifact. He now understood the terrible power of the trapezohedron, the history it held, and the fate it promised. He tore his eyes away, only to find the dark figure still watching him, its presence still unwavering. It did not speak, but its silence was louder than any sound. Blake knew that his life had been irrevocably altered, that he had been drawn into a narrative far older and far greater than he could even fathom, and that his own story had now become entwined with the artifact's unending tale. He also knew that the artifact had called to him, and him alone. Lucas could have brought any number of experts on ancient Egyptian artifacts that were far closer than Blake had been. But he called him. Blake believed it was because the artifact had silently commanded him to. "What do you wish of me?" Blake asked the figure, its emotionless face bathed in the crimson light. Again it answered him not in words, but through fully formed thoughts. "But how do I get it past security?" Blake asked. "I'm on camera, on the sign-in list. They'll catch me. They'll—" Calm filled his unraveling mind as the figure assured him that he was now under its protection, that if he was faithful, all of the knowledge he ever desired would be his. From beyond the door of the conservation area, Blake began to hear the sounds of screams, and an unearthly shriek of something that hunted from the shadows. Once the noise had died down, Blake placed the trapezohedron back within its box and closed the lid. He carried it through the door of the conservation area, stepping over the body of Lucas as he did so. He knew he should feel bad about the younger man's death, but instead he felt nothing. It had been a necessary sacrifice, one that in the grander scope of time meant very little. As Blake exited out into the museum proper, he saw the carnage that had been wrought. The bodies of the security staff lay everywhere, torn open and broken, some having been melted into a twitching mass by some unknown fluid, many ripped apart like rag dolls. Blake retrieved the records of the artifact's arrival, every door he approached opening for him. Unknown to him, the cameras blurred as he passed by them. The footage of him arriving at the museum that night inexplicably erasing itself, baffling the morning staff as to the cause of the destruction they would find at first light. Throughout that first morning following his claiming of the artifact, bodies would be found from Massachusetts to Rhode Island. Everyone who had been involved in the trapezohedron's discovery, everyone who had seen it, or the box that it was contained within, everyone who had been told of its existence, was visited by the thing that hunts the shadows that night. Some of them were found within their own beds, seeming to have been electrocuted. Others were found on the streets, as if they had tried to flee the shadow that came for them. Yet fleeing would avail them not, as by the time the sun rose the following day, all had been slain. Once all traces of the artifact's time within the Fulcrum Museum had been erased, Blake stepped out into the cool night air, his prize tucked protectively underneath his right arm. Professor Edward Blake spent years gazing into the trapezohedron's depths, letting its knowledge pour over him like cooling water. As time went on, his fractured mind grew more distant from his fellow man as he began to view humanity with the mild interest of one who watches an ant farm. Those who came into contact with Blake during those years noted a drastic shift in the man's demeanor, how just being in his presence would trigger their fight-or-flight response, as if they were in the presence of someone who only appeared to be human. In some ways, they were right, and they were right to be afraid. Over the years of studying the artifact, Blake committed dozens of sacrifices, feeding the trapezohedron in return for the knowledge he craved. At the behest of these visions, Blake began giving private viewings of the artifact, beginning with his local senator, and then using that connection to begin reaching out to leaders of industry and political powerhouses. He knew that he did not need to tell them about what they would have to do for whatever they sought. The first vision would be enough for that. He never asked them where they found their sacrifices. He never judged them for their desperate pleas before they figured out what must be done, just as he had. He never asked them what the trapezohedron showed them once they had received their visions and emerged with satisfied grins from the dark room in his home where he kept it. He had seen the results from what they must have been shown within his own visions. He had seen the grand scope of what the god of the artifact would bring about. Humanity was like a forest, Blake had come to realize. A forest that grows complacent and stale. A forest that must be periodically burned down in order for something new to grow in its place. Blake saw that the carousel would break under the artifact's influence, just as many cycles had been broken before. Throughout history, many had tried to hide it, Some had even tried to destroy it, but the shining trapezohedron always found its way back into the hands of the sentient. The world would be reset, mankind returning to the beginning, providing fresh entertainment to the crawling chaos, the man from the desert. The powerful were its congregation, and through their own lust for control and wealth, they would break this world and reduce it to ash. And Blake would watch and chronicle the events that led to the end, adding his own tale to its long and bloody history. He was the one that the artifact had chosen. Like Nephrin Ka and countless others before him, he was now the high priest of the Faceless God. Thank you for joining us here at Nightmares Incorporated, and we hope to see you again next time when we bring you another original story. Until then, sweet dreams.